So good evening, everyone, dear ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second Zoom lecture of the 55th public lecture series of the Archaeological Research Unit, celebrating 30 years of teaching and research since its foundation in 1991. It is a great pleasure to introduce our tonight's speaker, Vasiliki or Lina Kassianidou, Professor in Environmental Archaeology and Archaeometry. Lina joined the Archaeological Research Unit and the University of Cyprus and the Department of History and Archaeology of the University of Cyprus as a lecturer in 1994. In 2013, she was promoted to the rank of professor, while in 2015, she was appointed director of the Archaeological Research Unit by the Senate, a position she held until September 2019. Professor Kassianidou studied at Bryn Mawr College in the USA, where she did a double major in chemistry and classical and Near Eastern archaeology. She received her bachelor's degree with a distinction cum laude in 1989. She continued her studies at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London, where she received her doctoral title in archaeometallurgy in 1993. Her research focuses on ancient technology and specifically the production and trade of Cypriot copper throughout antiquity, but also on the impact of the copper industry on the Cypriot landscape and environment. She has taken part and directed a number of field and analytical projects related to her fields of expertise and has an extensive list of publications, which include 4 edited volumes, 2 co-authored volumes, and more than 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals, edited volumes, and conference proceedings. Lina has successfully coordinated 3 research projects funded by the Research and Innovation Foundation of Cyprus. She has also participated in and coordinated a number of projects funded by the European Union. The most important amongst these was a Marie Curie initial training network entitled New Archaeological Research Network for Integrating Approaches to Ancient Material Studies, or NARNIA as most of us know it, which she set up and coordinated. It consisted of a consortium of 9 partners from 6 different countries and received funding of 4.6 million euros, about which Lina should be proud, not just thanks of the amount of funds, but also, and most importantly, because NARNIA provided the research stage for a great number of PhD candidates and postdoctoral researchers. Furthermore, Professor Kassianidou has coordinated 2 Marie Curie individual fellowships. She has also coordinated the project entitled Skouriotissa, Interdisciplinary Study of the Archaeology and Environment of Cyprus's Last Operating Copper Mine, funded by the A.G. Leventis Foundation through the University of Cyprus Internal Research Program Scheme. Professor Kassianidou has also been active in the administration of the University of Cyprus, having served as Vice Chair of the Department of History and Archaeology, as a member of the Senate, and as a member of various senatorial committees. She also served, as I also said at the beginning, as director of the Archaeological Research Unit. She is also a member of the Cyprus National Commission for UNESCO, while from 2014 to 2016, she served as the president of the Board of Trustees of the Cultural Foundation of the Bank of Cyprus, and in 2018, the Ministers' Council of the Republic of Cyprus appointed her as a member of the Board of Directors of the National Board of Research and Innovation. Congratulations, Lina. Lina will present to us this evening a highlight of her numerous and stimulating research endeavors related to the systematic study of copper production, consumption, and trade towards the end of the Late Bronze Age. And here, before giving the floor to Lina, I would like to kindly ask you to keep your microphones muted during the lecture, and if you wish to turn off your cameras, you may be able you will be able to turn them on again in case you want to address a comment or a question to our speaker during the Q&A session, or you can use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. So, Lina, off to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thanasi. I hear a lot of noise. Okay.
Okay. It's off now, yes.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be giving a lecture in this forum. The Archaeological Research Unit that Thanasis has in the background of his screen has been a home for me since 1994. and I've been very, very fortunate to have worked initially with Professor Kassianidou as the director, and then Dimitris Michailidis. And I owe a lot to both of them. If it wasn't for their nourishing friendship and collaboration, I don't think I would have been here today and managed to do all this. The Archaeological Research Unit has given me also my husband, who is sitting in the back. If it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have met and got married after sharing an office opposite each other. And of course, I am grateful for all the colleagues and all my postdocs, past and present, and all my doctoral students, and everybody in the unit. I think what makes this a great place to work is the collegiality and the friendship among us. So thank you all for being here. It's so nice to see so many friends from all over, from the west to the east, and the north to the south. So thank you very much. I will now share my screen. Just make sure that. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Thank you. Right, so let's start. So as Thanasis said, the title of my lecture is Cypriot Copper Production, Consumption and Trade Before and During the 12th Century BC. I've added the before because I'm doing a little bit of a background. So, in 1964, Catling published a seminal work entitled Cypriot Bronze Work in the Mycenaean World. Throughout the volume, 12th century BC is presented as a pivotal point in time during which Aegean settlers launched copper production on the island and exported the metal in the shape of oxhide ingots for the first time. Catling furthermore strongly believed that metalworking also only flourished in Cyprus after the arrival of the Mycenaeans. Today, more than 50 years since the publication of Catling's book, our understanding of Cyprus in the late Bronze Age is quite different. In the time lapsed, excavations of Cyprus have brought to light many important late Cypriot sites that were barely known in the 60s. Beyond Cyprus, there have been some extraordinary discoveries regarding the international trade of Cypriot copper, such as the Uluburun shipwreck, dating to the end of the 14th century BC, where more than 10 tons of copper, most probably produced on the island, were found. In the last 2 years alone, there have been two remarkable discoveries. A new shipwreck loaded with copper ingots was found off the coast of Antalya, and the preliminary evidence, namely the shape of the oxhide ingots, suggests that this is earlier than Uluburun. Furthermore, excavations at the small island of Chrysi off the south coast of Crete brought to light a settlement that was clearly involved in the production of purple dye. In one of the buildings, a metal hoard was found, and it included an oxhide ingot of the earlier Buchholz type 1, broken in 2 pieces, as well as a folded saw and bronze vessels. Furthermore, excavations at the small island of Chrysi off the south coast of Crete brought to light a settlement that was clearly involved in the production of purple dye. Let us also not forget the advantages offered today by analytical techniques that were not available at the time of publication of Catling's book. The most important is without doubt lead isotope analysis, which offers an opportunity to understand the provenance of the raw material and thus reconstruct trade networks through time. All this new data from new excavations on the island and overseas, on land and under the sea, and interdisciplinary studies of new and old material enable us to formulate a very different view of the Cypriot copper industry and metalwork before and during the 12th century BC. For those of you who are not familiar with the period, I should explain why the 12th century merits such attention. It is within this century that the complex exchange systems of the late Bronze Age come to an end, as one after the other kingdoms and empires from Mycenaean Greece to Anatolia, the Levant and the Near East were destroyed. These are the so-called crisis years, which chronologically correspond to the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Cyprus, being in the heart of this intricate cultural network, was also affected by these events, albeit in different ways on the Aegean and the Levant. Invasions from the north, internal upheavals, the arrival of the sea peoples, as well as climate change causing drought, crop failure and famine, and other natural disasters such as earthquakes have all been presented as possible causes for the crisis. The aim of my paper is to investigate specifically the changes in Cypriot copper production, consumption and trade in the 12th century BC, which brought great changes in all aspects of life and culture of the island and the Eastern Mediterranean. In order to better understand the state of the Cypriot copper industry around 1200 BC and later, the evidence from the previous centuries will also be briefly presented and discussed. Copper was not the most precious metal in the second millennium BC. Nevertheless, it was a valuable commodity as it was an essential raw material for Bronze Age society. It is widely recognized that developments and changes taking place in the Old World in the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC were closely linked to the need to procure copper, tin, and precious metals. There are important copper sources in many areas surrounding the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, and these were exploited already since prehistoric times. Some of the most extensive copper ore deposits in this region are located on Cyprus in the periphery of the Troodos Mountains in the geological formation known as the Pillow lavas. The ores of Cyprus are sulfidic, and for copper to be extracted from them, a rather sophisticated multi-step process is required. This is probably why their exploitation started relatively late in comparison with the neighboring regions. By the middle of the 2nd millennium, however, bellows were invented and used to introduce a strong draft of air into the furnace through ceramic tuyères. Thus, high temperatures needed to completely melt the contents of the furnace were achieved, and as a result, little metal was lost in the slag. After smelting, the copper was cast into ingots of standard shape and weight and was shipped abroad. Cyprus's intimate relationship with copper production and trade was already revealed in 1897 during the very first excavations at Enkomi by the British Museum. The excavators came across the remains of a foundry, identified as such by the presence of a hoard consisting of ingot fragments, scrap metal, including casting jets, and a full set of metal smithing tools. They also found the first complete oxide ingot. The site, which lies on the east coast of the island, was later on simultaneously excavated by a French mission under the direction of Claude Scheffer and by the Department of Antiquities of Cyprus under the direction of Porphyrios Dikios. Their extensive excavations revealed the town plan and brought to light one of the most important and emblematic late Cypriot settlements. As Dikios could not expand his excavations horizontally, he expanded vertically, reaching the lowest levels of occupation, thus revealing Enkomi's long habitation history. Enkomi will therefore be extensively used in my paper to compare and contrast what we know about copper production and consumption before and during the 12th century. In the north part of the city, Dikios brought to light a building which was dedicated to copper production from the outset. In the lowest levels of occupation, dating to the 16th century BC, he found a rich archaeometallurgical assemblage consisting of metallurgical ceramics, such as tuyères and crucibles, and a very small amount of slag, the waste product of metallurgical processes such as smelting ores, but also refining and casting metal. Based on the typology of these tuyères and on comparisons with tuyères from the contemporary primary smelting site of Polydikophorades, I have argued that at least in the earliest phases, the Enkomi workshops were mostly involved in the refining and casting of copper, and that they were perhaps already producing copper oxide ingots. A detailed study of the metallurgical ceramics of from Enkomi, undertaken by Dimitrios Ioannidis within the framework of this doctoral research at the University of Cyprus, has now provided evidence. I have argued chemical analysis of the slag layers within the metallurgical ceramics revealed that they were used to process pure copper rather than copper alloys. The late Cypriot 2C, that is around the 1300 BC, the production of copper intensifies as indicated by the evidence from a number of primary and secondary sites. Among them is Vasiliki Karamallos, where in 1938 the remains of a miner settlement established sometime after 1300 BC came to light. The associated workshops must have been located at some other location but were not found. Sadly, now the whole hill has been obliterated by the modern open-cast mine. That copper was produced there in the late Cypriot from the local deposits is shown by the results of lead isotope analysis on slag samples from the excavation. A close look at the currently available evidence reveals that once again the most extensive workshops were found in Enkomi's Area 3. They were located in the west sector of a new, much larger building that was constructed there in this period. The copper workshops were organized around a central court. A rich metallurgical assemblage was collected from the rooms and open spaces. To the northwest of the building, Vikios discovered a slag dump that was presumably formed from material dumped there from the workshops. Slag and other archaeometallurgical finds were also found in the central sector, where Vikios identified a copper workshop in room 1, while a pit filled with slag was also found in room 45 of the east sector. Clearly, copper working was not limited to the western sector of the building in Area 3 in this period. Furthermore, a copper workshop that was already active in the 13th century BC was excavated by the French mission in Quartier 5E. In other words, copper workshops were also thriving in the central part of the town in the late Cypriot 2C. And just to show you here, Enkom is divided by a main road going from north to south and by other roads from east to west. And the neighborhoods, the quartier, we start with 1 on the north and going on all the way to 10 on the south, and it's west and east. Based on our systematic study of the material from Vikios' excavations undertaken within the framework of a project coordinated by George Papasavas and funded by the University of Cyprus, it is clear that there is a change not only in the scale, but also in the nature of the processes taking place. There are less metallurgical ceramics from levels corresponding to the late Cypriot 2C than the previous levels. At the same time, however, more slag was collected from this phase in Area 3 than from any of the previous phases. In addition, one should bear in mind that the actual amount of slag dating to this period may have been even larger, as it is quite possible that the slag heap was left by Vikios in situ intact or was at least only partially sampled. The slag will be the focus of our research in the near future. Material evidence for copper production or working is present in other late Cypriot 2C sites, such as Alassa, Maroni, and Kalavassos, but it is limited when compared to Enkomi. Indeed, the conclusion reached by the excavators of all 3 sites, that is, Sophocles Hadjisavas, Gerald Cadogan, and Alison South, is that based on the currently available evidence, it is olive oil production rather than copper smelting that holds the most prominent role in their economy. Of course, we should not forget that in all 3 cases, the excavations revealed monumental administrative buildings where one does not expect to find a metallurgical workshop. Such workshops may have existed in the unexcavated part of these sites. The only urban center which begins to produce significant amounts of metallurgical finds and perhaps may one day rival Enkomi is Hala Sultan Tekke, excavated by Peter Fisher. Let us now look at the evidence for copper production in the 12th century BC, which roughly corresponds with the late Cypriot 3A period. The 12th century comes with great cultural changes and significant transformations in settlement patterns. Many of the sites that thrived in the late Cypriot 2C, such as Alassa, Kalavassos, and Maroni, were abandoned. It is important to note that the miners' village of Vasiliki Karamallos was also abandoned at this time. Others, such as Pylako Kinokremos and Ma Paleokastro, were established in the years around 1200 BC. Enkomi, Hala Sultan Tekke, Kition, and Palepafos not only continued on, but they even showed evidence of prosperity. It is at this time that Enkomi was surrounded by a Cyclopean wall and that the ashlar building was constructed in Vikios' Area 1. This is French Quartier 4E. In the south-central part of this building, Vikios found the bronze statuette of the horned god. The establishment of the sanctuary of the ingot god to the southeast in Cartier 5 East is also placed in the 12th century BC. The ingot god himself epitomizes more than any other find the importance of the copper industry for the Cypriots and the Cypriot economy throughout the Bronze Age. He is part of a large iconographic repertoire where the oxide ingot shape appears that includes a female standing on the, sorry, the pages have been mixed up. Includes a female figurine standing on an ingot. Sorry, let me just, okay, sorry, just give me 1 second, please.
No problem.
Pages have been mixed. Ingot bearers depicted on four-sided stands, miniature ingots, and ingots on cylinder seals. At Gideon, a large-scale rebuilding plan included the construction of a Cyclopean wall around the city, and in Area 1, the construction of the Great Temple 1 with enormous finely worked drafted ashlar monoliths. A comparable monumental edifice was constructed at Palepaphos, and Iakovou has interpreted the apparent flurry of these two sites as a result of the power vacuum that was created by the abandonment of major late Cypriot 2C sites in the vicinity of Gideon and Palepaphos. In all of these settlements, none of which is close to a copper ore deposit, there is evidence of copper metallurgy and metalworking to a larger or smaller scale. At Palepaphos, the evidence is scanty, mainly because the 12th century BC levels were not extensively excavated. But within these earliest levels of the site, quantities of slag were recovered, and this led God already in 1951 to conclude that, and I quote, "The discovery of quantities of copper slag in its lowest layer offers an explanation of the wealth of the city." Slag was also found in Bothroi that lay below a Roman peristyle together with late Cypriot pottery. Palepaphos is thus seen as the gateway through which copper produced from the ore deposits in the Paphos forest was exported in the late Bronze Age. The late Cypriot necropolis in the area of Palepaphos, namely Teratsoudia and Eliomilia, have both produced a high number of bronze grave goods, exhibiting a trend which continues in the early Iron Age necropolis of the area, namely Skales and Plakes. A limited archaeometallurgical assemblage was also found at Mapalekastro. This included a partially preserved ceramic bellow, a small fragment of etuyere, and few pieces of slag, metal scrap, both copper base and lead, and 2 fragments of an oxide ingot. Lead isotope analysis showed that the lead is consistent with the deposits from Sardinia. This small assemblage indicates that metalworking rather than copper smelting was taking place at the site, otherwise more slag would have been found there. Karagiorgis excavations at Pylagou Kinokremos in the 1980s brought to light 2 very important hoards, namely a founder's hoard and a silversmith's hoard, but not any other metallurgical finds. 2 hoards of copper-based artifacts and several pieces of scrap metal and other bronze artifacts were recovered during the 2010 to 11 excavations by Karagiorgis and Athanasia Kanta, but again, no archaeometallurgical finds such as slag or metallurgical ceramics. This has now changed with the new excavations at the site by Joachim Brettschneider, Athanasia Kanta, and Jan Driesen. They found small quantities of slag, tuyères, and furnace fragments, and yet more hoards of copper-based artifacts. All these finds indicate that metallurgical or metalworking activities were indeed taking place in this settlement as well. The evidence from Gideon is much more substantial. As noted above, in the late Cypriot 3A, the sacred precinct was completely rebuilt on a grand scale. Among the new structures were 2 sets of workshops that were built in the vicinity of Temple 1. The western workshops were connected with the treatment and weaving of wool, and the northern workshops located between the north wall of Temple 1 and the city walls which were clearly connected to metalworking. In the late Cypriot 3A, an opening through the north wall of Temple 1 led directly to room 12. The excavations in these and adjacent rooms brought to light slag, metallurgical ceramics, scrap metal, and installations related to metallurgical activities. The discovery of the workshops led to discussions regarding the relationship of the copper industry and the textile industry with religion. Early studies of this material suggested that the workshops were involved in secondary smelting because of the presence of slag. After reviewing the evidence, I have argued that because of the quantity of the slag is small, it's more likely that these and the recovered furnaces were quite large. It was much more likely that the workshops were involved in the production and recycling of votive artifacts for and from the temple. A recent study of the metallurgical ceramics from the sacred precinct undertaken by Dimitrios Ioannidis has corroborated this argument by showing that they had been used to melt bronze rather than to smelt copper. Once again, it is Encami that has delivered the most abundant finds related to copper metallurgy, even though there is a clear break from the previous period. According to Dikios, the copper product workshops of Area 3 were abolished and copper working was transferred to other parts of the town. The building of Level 2B was destroyed and rebuilt at this time, but with a residential character. The slag dump was sealed and new rooms were added. In room 1, however, Dikios discovered a hoard of bronze weapons and other objects, including a casting of a bronze bowl and a fragment of a table, which led him to believe that the copper workshop remained active there. A look through Dikios' publication and the material kept in the storerooms of the Department of Antiquities reveals that some important archaeometallurgical finds were found in these levels in this building. These include the best preserved ceramic pot bellow, including the best preserved ceramic pot bellow. Surprisingly, there is more slag from these levels than any of the previous levels, and this is something that is puzzling. But again, one should bear in mind that in the previous period, it was clear that the workshops were cleaned and the slag was dumped outside the building. So this higher number may be misleading. In the late Cypriot 3A, metal workshops were active in many other parts of the city. Most of the evidence comes from the excavations of the French mission, which unfortunately have not been fully published. But some information regarding metallurgy was thankfully compiled in 2 publications by Courtois and Lagarce Let us have a look, starting from the first quartier just south of Dikios' Area 1, and we're moving one by one. In Quartier 2 West, the Schaeffer excavated the Maison de Trésor de Bronze, namely a building named after a hoard found that was dated around the 12th century. The hoard consists of 37 artifacts, most of them in good condition. In other words, they were not scrap metal. According to Kathleen, this was a mixed hoard with scrap and stock in trade, mixed together and hidden away for safekeeping. In Quartier 3 West, a number of oxide ingot fragments and 2 miniature ingots were found. In Quartier 4 West, which corresponds to Dikios' Area 1, 2 casting molds were found in the central part of the Ashlar building, in which the sanctuary of the horn god was also excavated. To the east, in Quartier 4 East, the French mission brought to light the remains of at least 2 workshops containing superimposed metallurgical installations and stone molds. Slag, perhaps produced in these workshops, was found in the adjoining street. In 5E, just to the north of the sanctuary of the ingot god, the French mission excavated a well where a very rich archaeometallurgical assemblage was found, including a hoard of bronze objects. Among the finds were the 4 Nahuatl 2 swords, 2 balance pans with bits and pieces of a chain, as well as balance weights and a large quantity of scrap metal, which included an oxide ingot fragment. All the scrap weighed about 4 kilos. Based on these finds, it is possible to suggest that the hoard belonged to a metalsmith who was active in this area. Even closer to the sanctuary of the ingot god, directly north of it, another well was found, filled with molds, tuyers, and fragments of crucibles. According to Courtois, this may very well have been the workshop which produced the ingot god itself, although there is no evidence to support this proposition. Evidence for a metallurgical workshop was found in the ruins of Bâtiment 18, one of the largest and most impressive buildings of Encomie, excavated by Schaeffer in Quartier 5 West. To the south, in Quartier 6 West, which was not extensively excavated, a rich archaeometallurgical assemblage was found. In this area, in 1966, half an ingot was found, and Schaeffer believed that it was part of the two hoards that had been found in the past, namely the Foundry hoard, which was discovered by the Turner bequest for the British Museum in 1897, and the so-called ingot hoard. The Foundry hoard comprised more than 70 finds and is one of the largest ever found in Cyprus. Schaeffer was convinced that the two other complete oxide ingots that appeared in the antiquities market in the 1930s also came from this area. One of the ingots was bought by Harvey Mudd, the owner of the Cyprus Mines Corporation, and is part of his collection of Cypriot antiquities that was given to Harvey Mudd College in California, and this was recently donated in its entirety to the University of Cyprus. The other ingot was donated in 1939 to the Cyprus Museum by George Di Palma, an antiquity seller who is actually the person who sold the ingot to Mudd. In Quartier 6E, metallurgical ceramics such as tuyères and crucible fragments, slag and scrap metal were recovered from the late Cypriot 3A levels of small rooms and buildings surrounding the so-called Bâtiment à la Colonne. Finally, Quartier 8E is where the so-called Maison de Bronze was excavated by Schaeffer in 1934. The house was named after the collection of impressive bronze artifacts found there. It is important to note that slag and other archaeometallurgical material was also connected in trial trenches located to the east of the Maison de Bronze. This shows that workshops could have also been active in this part of the city, but await to be discovered and properly excavated. Using Courtois' 1982 paper and Vitios' Encomie monograph, Pickles and Feltenberg suggested that there was a profound change in the way the copper industry at Encomie was organized from the late Cypriot I through the late Cypriot II to the late Cypriot IIIA. They argued that the dispersal of metalworking installations in several parts of the town indicates the dissolution of central control of metals in the late Cypriot IIIA. However, these authors, as well as Courtois, also point out that there is a relative paucity of level 1A and B exposures in the rest of the city, in all the other areas other than area 3. In other words, we actually do not know whether or not there were copper workshops in the central parts of Encomie in the earlier phases of occupation as well. In fact, going through the publications of the French mission, it is obvious that in those areas where they did reach the lower levels, they did come across evidence for copper work. I would therefore like to argue that perhaps that what has been found at Encomie cannot really be used as a sign for the dissolution of central control in the late Cypriot IIIA within this site. What the evidence does show clearly is that in the late Cypriot IIIA, the 12th century, the Encomie workshops were very busy, probably producing oxide ingots, as well as metal utilitarian artifacts such as sickles and axes, but also sophisticated items of high craftsmanship, such as the rod tripods and the four-sided stands, all of which were in high demand. Papasavas has argued that Encomie would have been one of the most active centers for the production of these bronzes, which are considered to be the hallmarks of Cypriot bronze work. This leads me to the next section of my paper, which is the consumption of copper on the island in the late Bronze Age. In the earliest phases of this period, namely from the middle of the 17th to the end of the 14th centuries BC, much of the copper was clearly exported in exchange for gold and silver, which were not available on the island but were greatly cherished. The allure of gold in the late Cypriot I to IIB society can be demonstrated using two examples, one from Encomie and one from Kalavasos tomb 11. this is the tomb that you see on the screen from Agios Dimitrios, received many gold artifacts weighing almost half a kilo, but only one bronze, a dagger. Enkomi tomb 93, which is chronologically placed no later than late Cypriot C, the richest of all late Cypriot tombs in terms of gold, contained no bronzes at all. According to Keswani, if one looks at the evidence from burials of late Cypriot 1 to 2b from all over the island, one will see that most of them contain no bronze objects, or at best, only a small number of undersized personal ornaments. This is the case even at Enkomi, where at this time the workshops of Area 3 were in full operation. Keswani found that the per capita consumption of copper-based artifacts, as recorded in the deposition of grave goods in tomb groups of the earliest phase of the late Cypriot, decreased in relation to the Middle Cypriot period. She suggested that this decrease could be the result of official restrictions put in place by elite groups in order to reduce the local distribution of copper and ensure its availability for export. Similarly, Bilidis suggested that perhaps copper artifacts were at this time too valuable to be placed in tombs, but were rather kept in order to be exchanged for other highly desirable artifacts. On the other hand, Papasavvas argued that, and I quote, by the beginning of the late Bronze Age, copper-based artifacts, which seem to have structured the discourse of power and social inequality in the earlier periods, appear to have become less attractive for the indigenous population. Imported precious materials appear by now to have offered an alternative choice for mortuary display. In other words, bronze appears to have been less important for the production of prestige artifacts in the earliest phase of the late Cypriot, in contrast to gold and silver, which were greatly appreciated. This is clearly why the king of Alashia pressingly asked the pharaoh of Egypt to send him much silver. It is in the 12th century BC, against this backdrop of intensified copper production and export, and of social transformation throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, that bronze working became a hallmark of Cypriot art and society. It is clearly not a coincidence that most of the ox-hide ingot fragments found on the island date to this period. They were mostly found in founders' hoards, thus they were clearly being used on the island as well as being exported. The largest number of ox-hide ingot fragments was part of the Mathiatis hoard, about the context of which we know very little. The 3 complete ox-hide ingots known to date from Cyprus were also dated to this period by Catling, although only the one in the British Museum was found in an excavation, and that was the excavations in the 19th century. Cypriot copper, alloyed with imported tin and sometimes lead, was used to produce an array of objects, including figurines, some such as the horn god and the ingot god, which were of exceptional size. The horn god is still today, more than 70 years since his discovery during Dikios' excavations in Area 1, one of the largest bronze statuettes from the Eastern Mediterranean. Although it was deposited at some point towards the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 11th century BC, it was most probably produced earlier than that. The same is true of the ingot god, who was probably initially a smiting god who was transformed into the ingot god. Apart from these 2 masterpieces, Cypriot workshops also produced other original types of artifacts of exceptional craftsmanship, such as the stands of various types, which appear in rich tombs of the late Cypriot III. In other words, bronze artifacts appear by this time to have taken a greater importance as symbols defining wealth and high status. The status of copper, and as a result of bronze, was in this period transformed from that of a base metal primarily destined for export to that of a material which could be used for prestigious artifacts in a less costly, albeit not unimpressive mode. Copper-based artifacts become more common not just in the funerary context, but also in the late Cypriot III phases of settlements. Again, Dikios excavations at Enkomi illustrate this phenomenon better than any other site. The significant increase of copper-based artifacts in the late Cypriot 3A and late Cypriot 3B is evident in this graph published by Keswani and based on the data from Dikios excavations. Clearly, this increase was not only because of the hoarding phenomenon, which characterizes the 12th century BC in particular. If the graph depicted the amount of metal in the various phases according to total weight rather than sheer numbers, then the contrast would have been even starker. The finds from the earlier phases are mainly small items such as scrap or pins, or more rarely weapons, while the artifacts from the later periods are often tools, which are much heavier. Indeed, according to Catling, in this period, a wide array of tools made of bronze are being made and used on the island. They include agricultural tools such as large shovels, hoes, pruning knives, and plowshares, and most importantly, metalsmithing tools such as charcoal shovels, tongs, and heavy hammers. Chemical analysis of the copper-based artifacts from Dikios excavations at Enkapi, undertaken by Dr. Andreas Haralambous, revealed that the alloy of choice was bronze. Hoards have been found in many excavated sites of the late Cypriot, and although they were initially all believed to have dated almost exclusively to the 12th century BC, it is now clear that there are hoards, such as the merchant's hoard from Kalavasos Aios Dimitrios, which date to the 13th century. The phenomenon of hoarding metals is, however, much more intense in the 12th century BC, in the Aegean as well as in Cyprus, and is believed to reflect troubled times of this period. Based mainly on their contents, but also on their context, when this was available, many of the Cypriot hoards were classified as founders' hoards. According to Knapp, Newley, and Newley, this type of hoard consists of scrap metal, castings, slag, and ingot fragments. They believe that it is within this framework that one should interpret the large number of metal hoards that characterize the transition from the 13th to the 12th century BC, and argue that, and I quote, "The use of scrap metal should therefore be seen as a sign of an expanding metal industry, a development prompted by a great increase in the amount of metal in circulation and in daily use," end of quote. This high demand is what led to the accumulation of metal in the workshops and subsequently in hoards, which were therefore should not be taken as an indication for a scarcity in metal supplies in the 12th century BC, as had been done in the past. This high demand even led to the looting of bronze artifacts from earlier late Cypriot I tombs at Kition. Most of the hoards are believed to have been buried for safekeeping because of the troubled times in the 12th century BC, but they were buried with intention to retrieve. For whatever reason, the metalsmiths who buried them were not able to recover their stock, whether this was raw metal in the form of ingots, scrap metal, or finished objects. In this way, the hoards provide us with the glimpses of some extraordinary bronze artifacts which were destined to be melted down and thus be lost forever. Such an example is an Astarte pendant from the recent excavation of Vassos Karagioris and Athanasia Kanda at Pila, Kokinokremos. An even more extraordinary artifact is a bronze ear that, before being deposited in a hoard buried in Mathiantis, was clearly part of an oversized composite sculpture. Typologically, the closest parallel is found in late Cypriot terracotta figurines, which may be an indication that it is a local product rather than import. No such sculpture is currently known from Cyprus, but they were common in contemporary sites in Egypt. Clearly, they also existed on the island, but have never been found. In the last part of my talk, I would like to turn to a discussion on the trade of Cypriot copper in the late Bronze Age. In order to be traded, whether locally or overseas, the copper produced on the island was cast into ingots. Different ingot shapes were used simultaneously throughout the late Bronze Age, as clearly indicated by the Uluburun shipwreck. The most characteristic type for the late Bronze Age, as it does not appear before or after that period, was the oxhide ingot. Thanks to the work of Noel Gale and Sophia Stoss Gale, the true scale of Cypriot copper trade in the late Bronze Age has been revealed through the lead isotope analysis of ingots from all over the Mediterranean and beyond. Lead isotope analysis has shown that all oxide ingots dating after circa 1400 BC are consistent with the Cypriot provenance, and more specifically with the ore deposit at Apliki and the other Solea district mines. Many of us now believe that the oxide ingot may have been the island's trademark, even if it was not invented there. Based on textual and archaeological evidence, in the 14th century BC, the scale of the trade of Cypriot copper truly skyrockets. The textual evidence is provided in the well-known letters from Alashia, which were found in the archive of Tel El Amarna. In 5 of the 8 letters sent from Alashia to Egypt, shipments of copper metal are recorded. The fact that among those who correspond with the pharaoh, the king of Alashia is the only one who sends copper has often been used as an argument to support the identification of Alashia with Cyprus. If we accept that the Amarna letters referred to numbers of ingots or talents of copper, then in the 5 letters, a total of about 29,000 kilos of metal was shipped in a short period of time of about 15 to 30 years. It is thanks to the discovery of Uluburun that such large shipments of copper as the ones mentioned in Amarna letters no longer seem implausible. Although copper was clearly produced in many other areas, such as Anatolia, the Balkans, Sardinia, Cypriot copper seems to have been sought after even in these areas, and thankfully for us, hoarded. The reason may be that perhaps Cypriot copper had an advantage. It was free of impurities such as lead, arsenic, antimony, etc. In the 13th to 12th centuries BC, small-scale trade based on private mercantile enterprises acquired a vital role in the circulation of commodities and materials, at the expense of the monopolistic control and without the support of international diplomacy that prevailed in the previous periods. According to Sue Sherrod, and I quote, "Not only was considerably more ready alloyed bronze being introduced into the system at a variety of social levels, but it was gaining a growing velocity of predominantly maritime circulation in a manner increasingly beyond the reach of any form of interregional or local centralized control." End of quote. The 2 shipwrecks off the coast of Anatolia have often been used to illustrate the change. Dating to the end of the 14th century BC, the ship that sank at Uluburun was carrying 10 tons of copper and 1 ton of tin, as well as other exotic raw materials, and is believed to have been on a royal mission. Dating to the end of the 13th century BC, circa 1200, the ship that sank at Cape Gelidonia also carried copper and tin. The size of the metal cargo was significantly smaller, recently recalculated to 1,135 kilos. In other words, it is only a tenth of the copper cargo of Uluburun. More importantly, the ship also carried fragments of ingots of various types. In fact, 32 of the raw copper was in the form of ingot fragments. The ship also carried a significant number of metal objects, such as agricultural and other types of tools and scrap metal. The presence of scrap metal is perhaps the element which sets the 2 shipwrecks apart and has been discussed extensively ever since the discovery of Cape Gelidonia for various reasons, including changes in trade patterns. George Bass argued that the ship was that of a private merchant and that it also carried a tinker on board. Interestingly, according to Linder, the cargo of ingots, agricultural tools, craftsmen's tools, and weapons are similar to those listed as part of the cargo of a ship of Alashia, described in the text from Ugarit. The Cape Gelidonia oxide and bun ingots are isotopically identical with the ingots from Enkami and slag from Kalavasos Agios Dimitrios, so they too are consistent with the Cypriot provenance. Also consistent with the Cypriot provenance are many more oxide ingots from sites to the east and the west, showing that copper from Cyprus was traded in the form of oxide ingots throughout the 12th and into the 11th century BC. In the coast of Israel, several shipwrecks with metal cargoes have been excavated, and at least 2 of them, those at Hahodrim and Kfar Samir North, seem to have carried a cargo similar to that of the Cape Gelidonia ship, namely fragments of oxides and other ingots and scrap metal. They are both most probably of a similar date. In addition, the oxide ingot fragments from far Summit North are consistent with the Cypriot provenance and have a lead isotope fingerprint similar to the one of the ingots from Cape Caledonia. Moving to the Aegean, the ingot fragments recovered from Mycenaean sites, such as the ones from the excavations at the site of Kanakia on the islands of Salamis, date to the 12th century, as does the ingot fragment from Emporio on Chios. All analyzed examples were found to be isotopically consistent with Cyprus. The same is true of a quarter of an oxide ingot found in Agia Triada on Crete, which dates to the 12th century BC. Similar date has been given to the hoard of oxide ingot fragments and other bronze artifacts in a fragmentary state found at the island of Lipari. Weighing a total of 75 kilos, this is one of the largest hoards ever found in Italy. The widest distribution of Cypriot copper oxide ingot fragments dating to the last phase of the late Bronze Age is found in Sardinia, where such ingots have been discovered in 40 sites spread all over the island. The chronology of these hoards is not precisely defined, but several date to the 12th and even the 11th century BC. Although in a recent paper, Russell and Knapp have been very critical of the former discussions regarding a special relationship between the two large Mediterranean islands, I still believe that such a relationship did exist. And we have now a few pieces of pottery and lead from at least two sites that is consistent with the provenance from Sardinia. In other words, in the 12th century and even through the 11th, Cypriot copper in the form of oxide and bun ingots was apparently still exported far and wide. After the 11th century, the oxide ingot type, so characteristic of Cyprus, was no longer used. This trademark was lost, and so was the visibility of Cypriot copper overseas. Thanks to the lead isotope analysis, we now know that Cypriot copper was used. The work of Reinhard Jung on several artifacts from late Helladic 3C have found them to be consistent with the Cypriot provenance. One major difference that occurs in this latest phase of the Bronze Age is the fact that apart from Cypriot copper as raw material, finished objects were also being exported. For example, the rod tripods and four-sided stands and that are found in the Levant, the Aegean, and the Central Mediterranean, and also exported where the amphorate craters, at least two of which have been found in the Aegean, one in Pandanassa, shown here, and one in Lefkandi. Apart from these objects of high craftsmanship, also agricultural tools were being exported, as seen by the Cape Caledonia ship cargo, but also by the discovery of such Cypriot type tools in Greek hoards, such as the Athens Acropolis hoard and the Athidon hoard from Boeotia. To conclude, the evidence collected from the study of new but also old excavations and from a series of interdisciplinary studies of archaeometallurgical assemblages and metal artifacts shows that the 12th century was not the beginning of the Cypriot copper industry, but rather the culmination. Cypriot copper was already produced and exported in large quantities from at least the middle of the 15th century BC, if not before. Furthermore, it is in the 13th century BC that we should seek the most accomplished metalworkers who produce such masterpieces as the gods from Enkomi or the four-sided stand. All late Cypriot sites have continued to thrive in the 12th century, namely Enkomi, Gideon, Halas Teke, and Palepafos had buzzing metal workshops. Pickles and Peltenberg argued that this plethora of workshops indicates the culmination of a long-term trend towards the dissolution of central control of metals. However, we need to differentiate between two different stages in the chaîne opératoire of metal production. The first is extractive metallurgy for the production of copper metal from ores, and the second is metalworking for the production of copper ingots and metal artifacts, whether of high status or everyday life. Although the presence of slag and strata of the 12th century in these urban centers indicates some form of metallurgical activity related to copper production was taking place there, the metallurgical ceramics and the molds suggest that the workshops were mostly busy producing finished objects. The increase in the number of workshops, I believe, is a result of the high demand for bronzes, not only in Cyprus but also abroad, rather than a sign of the dissolution of central control of the production and trade of Cypriot copper. The fact that up to now, all the ingots that date to the 12th century and 11th century, as well as much of the slag from the urban centers, are still traced mostly to a single source mining district, that of Solea, is, I believe, a sign of continued central control, at least of the export of the metal. Much of this activity came to an end as the crisis that enveloped the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean affected Cyprus as well, even if it did not have the catastrophic effect that it had on other regions. The manifestation of bronze artifacts as valued status symbols, however, survived, at least in one site that transcended the Mediterranean-wide crisis, and this is, of course, Palepafos. Here, there was no violent break in the life of the settlement, but rather a gradual transition into the early Iron Age, while at the same time it retained its initial prominent position. An important role for this seemingly smooth transition is to be credited to the sanctuary at Koukia, in later times one of the most famous cult places of Aphrodite. Excavations of the two early Iron Age necropolis, Palepafos Skales and Palepafos Plakes, undertaken by the Department of Antiquities over the last 40 years, have shown that Palepafos and its bronze industry thrived into the Iron Age. This is clearly demonstrated by the lavish metal artifacts deposited in tombs of early Iron Age in equally great, if not greater numbers, as in the late Cypriot period. Above all, the evidence from the mining regions shows that copper production on the island not only continued, but actually intensified in the Iron Age. But this is another long story, which will be recounted in another long lecture. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lina, for this rich and illustrative presentation and discussion of archaeological evidence for metalworking, copper consumption within the island's context. Fascinating assemblages, I have to say, with wider implications in Cypriot technology, economy, what else? Trade networking and symbolic or social display, as you have pointed out yourself. I'm not a specialist, so I will now let our speakers address any comments or questions directly to you by using the chat function at the bottom of your screen, or raise your hand and just turn your camera on and unmute your microphone to speak with Lina or address your question to her. Thank you very much.